This is the Chapter 45 endocrine lecture. This is one of my favorite lectures because I think that the endocrine system gives a lot of interesting things that you can choose to understand. And it also gives a couple neat systems that all kind of fall into the same concept. When we go through this lecture, a lot of stuff will be in two parts, so things will be in pairs. So for example, we lead off with the endocrine versus nervous system, and the fact that the endocrine system often is contrasted with the nervous system. And the big contrast is based off speed and target. So the nervous system is a fast way to target one small place in the body, which is anywhere that is innervated with that particular kind of nerve. But the endocrine system is a much slower speed system that targets the whole body in many cases. Okay. Now the other thing that's interesting about this is that the endocrine and nervous system overlap. So we will have some integration between the two, and we will do some things like neuroendocrine pathways where you clearly got the brain dropping, stimulating cells to release a hormone to send a hormone signal to the rest of the body. Speaking of which, another way that we can look at things is based on distance and based on target. Okay, so what are we going there with? Okay, endocrine specifically is a long distance signal. This is going to contrast with paracrine signaling, where paracrine is going to be a local regulator. Okay, so that's close by. So endocrine is long range, paracrine short range. And there's something we won't really talk about in this lecture, but there's autocrine, which actually is self-targeting. A lot of tissues do this to themselves sometimes. The uterus, for example, is a self-targeting autocrine tissue. So there's just some pictures that go along with that concept. Also, to link several things together, we're going to see in the immune system that white blood cells will routinely release hormones whose sole purpose is to smack the white blood cell on the outside and give it a signal. So remember these types of signaling because we're going to combine them, especially when we get up to the nervous system. We're also going to be really talking about 3 or 4 of these at the same time. Now, another contrast that we're going to give you between the nervous system and the endocrine system, and I know I'm jumping ahead to the nervous system, but you're going to see it, is that in the nervous system there are going to be chemical messengers that are going to be released right in the gap of a synapse, and they'll reach across that gap and they'll smack into a receptor, and then that process will give you that will give you the carrying on of the nervous signal. This is so short range that it's not even really considered a paracrine signal, especially since it's part of the nervous system. It's just the standard way nervous tissue works. It uses chemical messages. But other than the fact that it's in another named system, that we've named the system something else, it really does behave just like an endocrine system otherwise, in that you've got a chemical molecule and a receptor. Now, we're going to make things weird, and we're going to get into the idea of neuroendocrine pathways, which kind of add several things together. And in this, what you do is you have a nervous tissue that comes down through synapses, different nerves connected to each other, to a neurosecretory cell. As that neurosecretory cell receives a signal from the nervous system, it then releases hormones, and these are called specifically neurohormones because they came out of an extension of the nervous system, out of the brain usually. And these are a lot of what's going to come out of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. These hormones are going to rush out, and they're called the neurohormones, as opposed to your standard endocrine hormone, like something, let me do a good example of this, testosterone. Okay, testosterone and the follicle stimulating hormone tend not to follow this as much. Okay, so testosterone, for example, comes from the testes, of course. It's not coming from a nervous innervation. It's a tissue that just releases the signal kind of constantly without much change. Another example like this would be, let's see, what's a good one? Your glucocorticoids, your long-term stress response hormones. They don't come so much from the brain as they do from other tissues. So, in summary, you have a nervous synapse where the target of the neuron is usually another neuron, okay, or maybe even a direct cell target, because sometimes your body can do that. Like your nervous system can target your stomach and cause it to grind, for example, and cause the muscles to change shape. Then you have neurosecretory, just like we talked about, which is a neuroendocrine pathway. Pheromones we're not going to talk about, but that's kind of like super endocrine. That's, you know, even longer distance than endocrine. Everybody hears pheromone and they usually think sex. Really, the key to a pheromone is that it leaves the body and signals another organism. Doesn't take much information on there. Now, another key pair of topics: tropic versus non-tropic. Okay. Non-tropic hormones just hit the body. So adrenaline, for example, hits regular portions of the body. It hits your blood vessels, it hits your muscles. Those are regular body portions. So does prolactin. That's a hormone that targets the mammary glands, causes them to produce milk. And I know everybody thinks that it must be an endocrine gland because it's it's mammary gland, right? But no, it's not about gland or not. It's about endocrine or not. Okay, so here's an example of a tropic hormone. This is a two-step pathway. This hit from one endocrine gland to another. Okay, a follicle-stimulating hormone. Okay, comes out of the brain, comes out of the pituitary, and smacks into the testes or ovaries, causing them to release hormones. Okay, so it's a hormone-to-hormone conversation. This is a common scenario. You have a lot of signaling from the hypothalamus, a region of the brain, to the pituitary, which is kind of this little piece of nervous tissue that hangs down below it. A lot of it involves paracrine, which means short range, tropic hormones. So the hypothalamus will send a short range tropic hormone that targets the pituitary. Then the pituitary, in response, will release the hormone that was just signaled by the hypothalamus. This is not neurosecretory in the case of the pituitary there, whereas other pituitary hormones are direct neurosecretory. Some are responding in this 1-2 process, this tropic pathway. So every time we talk about hormones, you should be thinking endocrine versus paracrine. You should be thinking simple endocrine versus neurohormone. Okay, and you should be thinking tropic versus non-tropic. All three are relevant to our conversations. There are several different ways a hormone can be made. The most commons are a short, and I mean short, polypeptide. Don't think of a protein with three-dimensional, tertiary structure. Think like 10 amino acids max, 15 if we're really stretching it, really short. Or some weird variant of an amino acid where you've cleaved off a part or you added something extra. Or in the case of steroids, when we talk about testosterone and estrogen, you're looking at cholesterol, you're looking at a lipid. The most important fact when considering hormones is not to think about what class they're part of or how they do their job, because in key, they don't do a job. They don't do a job any more than a red light stops your car. It's just a signal for you to stop. If you choose to ignore it, the car will continue forward just fine. Just like insulin. Everybody thinks, in the back of their heads, at least before a nutrition lecture, that insulin comes in and slams the brakes and somehow stops sugar from accumulating, that the insulin destroys the sugar, and that's not true. It just signals your body to take the sugar in. But you should remember that from the digestion chapter. A little bit of quick review. You should remember from the cell signaling chapter, I believe chapter 7, back in 2107, that water-soluble hormones can travel freely through the bloodstream, but they cannot travel freely into a cell. They smack into that plasma membrane and it blocks them. However, lipid-soluble hormones can cut straight across that plasma membrane. So the difference is that a lipid-soluble hormone can go straight through the plasma membrane and engage the cell internally. Whereas a water-soluble hormone has to hit a cell surface receptor and it never actually enters the cell most of the time. There's no real benefit to putting a channel in there for the hormone so that it can come in and hit an internal receptor. Might as well just grab it on the external surface and save yourself a protein. Remember that lipid-soluble hormones will still have receptors. For example, estrogen receptor, and whether or not a particular a particular cancer does or does not express the estrogen receptor has a big impact on breast cancer treatment and survival. Where is that receptor? It's inside the cell. And to you, you wouldn't think of it as a receptor. Because, you're used to receptors grabbing hold of things on the surface. This thing, estrogen grabs it, and it goes straight to the nucleus and starts transcribing DNA. Estrogen receptor is a transcription factor. Okay, it can serve two roles, but that's how the system works with lipid soluble hormones. In fact, a lot of the intracellular, and that's inside the cell, receptors for your lipid soluble hormones are themselves a transcription factor, and they're just waiting for the hormone to come along in order to activate. I'm not going to step you through this whole process, but an example that links back to a figure that you saw back in chapter 7. Okay, the G protein coupled receptor is relevant when we're talking about adrenaline. That's epinephrine is adrenaline. It's the same thing. Okay, and if you've been scared by something, you're in your fight or flight mode, and your body has just dumped this epinephrine into your bloodstream. When it grabs that receptor, of course, that causes the G protein to grab hold of GTP, release GDP that it was holding. And the GTP allows it to go and interact with somebody. Who's it interact with? One of our famous signal transduction molecules called adenylyl cyclase. It's going to take ATP, turn it cyclic AMP, which then activates protein kinase A. Gosh, I said I wasn't going to go through it, but here I'm going step by step. And a key to this is that it promotes the breakdown of glycogen into, okay, now, what do you put together to build glycogen? Okay, glycogen looks a lot like starch, which means it's a long chain of, answer to yourself, glucose. And so we're taking stored glucose and we're liberating it as free molecules of glucose. We're also going to inhibit the synthesis of more of this glycogen because we don't want to make more, we want to break it down. All right. It's a little more boring to go through a lipid soluble hormone because it just kind of goes through, grabs hold of a receptor, and there you go. Okay. Hormones can have multiple effects depending on the tissue type they're smacking into. So same hormone can have opposite or oblique effects to itself. And epinephrine, adrenaline, once again, helps you see this point. Because epinephrine can smack an alpha receptor on a blood vessel and cause the blood vessel to constrict. Okay, this might be in your intestines to prevent you from absorbing food because we want to divert blood away from absorbing food and instead to the tissues that have a beta receptor. Now those blood vessels will dilate, and then those are the blood vessels in your skeletal muscles, which are going to cause you to run. And the blood vessels in your lungs, okay, blood vessels in your brain are all going to dilate and let more energy get through, let more oxygen get through. That's a case of a different receptor. But even then, you can have a different response from the same receptor if you have a different signal transduction pathway. Okay, so once again, the beta receptor on a liver cell doesn't result in constriction or dilation. The beta receptor here results in breakdown of glycogen, which we were talking about earlier. Okay, and there are some famous, by the way, local regulators, some famous the paracrine signaling molecules that love to hit side by side. Cytokines and growth factors are an example of this. Nitric oxide, which is also used by the nervous system as a neurotransmitter, which tells you why if you go to the dentist and get laughing gas, how it makes you feel drunk. Okay, it's interfering with nervous transmission. And also the prostaglandins, which both are involved in reproduction and also in immunity. Oh yeah, the same kind of hormone can be used to do reproduction. For example, the prostaglandins in ejaculate can cause the uterus to contract. Okay, that increases the odds of sperm going up into the fallopian tubes. But prostaglandins coming from immune cells cause localized inflammation. Right, it's the same hormone. What happened there? Okay, well, your body has learned that in one context, this hormone means muscle contraction. In a completely different context, we can use that exact same hormone over again. Why bother inventing a new hormone? Let's just deal with it in a new context with new options. Okay. They also help you, by the way, with blood clotting. Okay, which kind of makes sense that if you've got a wound that's getting infected, you might also want formation of blood clots in the area, and you want the immune system to get in there and pay attention to that. So it's a self-reinforcing process. Okay. Oh, by the way, prostaglandins, of course, were first discovered as the thing that comes from the prostate gland, though it also comes from other tissues. All right. Simple hormone pathways are boring. Here's how it works. Not really, but yeah, sort of. A cell, an endocrine tissue, is going to release the hormone. It's going to hit a blood vessel. The blood vessel will carry it all over the body, including to some particular target tissue, but to everywhere else as well. Okay, and then that hormone, once it hits the target cell, gives you a response, and usually there's a feedback to stop the signaling to begin with. So they gave the example of the duodenum. Okay, this is the top of the small intestine. If it senses acid, out comes secretin. Secretin hits the pancreas and causes it to secrete bicarbonate. Okay, bicarbonate, which will neutralize the acid. And the effect of this gives us a negative feedback because now the low pH disappears. The pH comes back up, so your cells stop secreting the secretin. Okay. That's pretty straightforward. Neuroendocrine pathways are a little more complicated. What they usually involve is a neurosecretory pathway where here the example would be a whole bunch of neurons in your body. The brain with sensory neurons, yada yada. Maybe this sensory neuron was targeted by the brain, specifically stimulating it because you saw a pretty girl. Or maybe that sensory neuron is sensing something directly. The hypothalamus and pituitary do a lot of crap. So maybe it was sensing the levels of oxytocin in your bloodstream or things like that. Okay. What you're going to do is you're going to have the hypothalamus run down, have nervous cells, neurosecretory cells that run down through a portion of the pituitary and squirt that hormone straight into the bloodstream. Okay, so this didn't come from a simple endocrine gland. This came from a neuro hormone. Okay, so it's being dropped out. And that, of course, smacks the breast muscles, causing them to relax, which allows the milk to flow out. Two things to remember. One, is this a tropic or non-tropic hormone, this oxytocin? I know it's a neurohormone, but is it tropic or non-tropic? If you said non-tropic, you're correct because the breast is not an endocrine gland. It produces no hormones. Okay. Now, interesting thing, though, the release of the milk is a positive feedback process. You don't want to keep the milk level just barely balanced. Hey, I knew there was another positive feedback. I'd forgotten which it was. It was milk release. You don't want, just like birth, where you want to push the baby all the way out, with milk release, you don't want to hold the milk at a perfectly balanced state. You want to push it out and give it to the kid. So therefore, the action of the smooth breast, of the smooth muscle in the breast relaxing, sends a stimulus back up to the hypothalamus that says, "Hey, do that some more." And so you get more and more oxytocin coming out until it's fully relaxed. Okay, and there's no more milk to create any more tension. Okay, that was point number one, that this was a non-tropic hormone. And that it was positive feedback. Point number two, no, the baby does not suck the milk out of mommy's breast. Okay, they are not little vacuums. If you've ever had a child or ever watched a child breastfeed or feed on a bottle, they are massaging with their mouth. They're making this little back and forth, almost a chewing motion, which can get trying if they get some teeth earlier in life, but they're not making a hard sucking motion. So much, or they're not supposed to be, because what they're doing is they're stimulating the region around the nipple with it's loose tissue. It moves back and forth, and the sliding action of the surface tissue sliding over the underside tissue, okay, that you can't see. I think it's lactiferous sinuses is what those are called. It's innervated tissue. If you slide it back and forth, what it does is it sends that original nervous signal to the hypothalamus that says, "Hey, release the oxytocin that will cause the muscles to relax to release the milk." Okay, so it's allowing it to flow out. Now that sounds a little complicated, doesn't it? Wouldn't it make more sense if those nerves went straight from the area around the nipple straight to the smooth muscles and told them to relax directly? Yeah, that sounds simpler to me too. I don't know why that's not the way it is, but that's not the way we evolved. Okay, we evolved to use this oxytocin thing, which also makes you sleepy and forgetful. Gee, people wonder why pregnancy is so trying sometimes. Okay. You already know about insulin and glucagon. I already talked about it in class with you, so I'm not really even going to go into it. I'm going to skip straight over it. Diabetes I'll hit. Type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Everybody calls it diet controlled. I want to call it, or versus non-diet. I want to call it insulin dependent and insulin non-dependence or non-insulin dependent. Type 1 diabetes is when your beta pancreatic cells are destroyed by your immune system. it's a mistake. It's like an allergy or something like that, or it's like getting multiple sclerosis or things where you're attacking your own body tissue. Crohn's disease is another example. It's where you're attacking your own intestinal lining. Those are all negative things. Type 2 diabetes is actually unrelated in cause. There is no similarity in the cause of it. What's happened is usually in the uptick in type 2 diabetes in this country is particularly because it's not a deficiency of insulin, it's a resistance to insulin. It's that a person has had so much sugar in their bloodstream for so long, so that their body has been producing so much insulin for so long that the body goes, you know what? Maybe there's really not all that much sugar in here at all. Maybe there's just an error somewhere in my pancreas. Let's just kind of tone it back a notch and ignore the insulin and not try to suck so much blood sugar out of the blood. And so the blood sugar rises because no matter how much insulin you produce, your body is starting to ignore it. It's getting tired of you yelling fire every day. Okay, that's one way it can do. Other ways that it can do is just simply not produce enough insulin. Technically, the onset of type 1 diabetes looks kind of like type 2. Before you've lost all of your insulin production, you start to get a lot of type 2 diabetes symptoms, and then you go into full type 1 diabetes once all of those cells have finally been killed. Okay, hypothalamus and pituitary are really where it's at for this lecture. All right, so let's talk about the pituitary here. First most important thing, the hypothalamus is a clear region of the brain. It's a portion of the brain. There's the thalamus, there's the hypo below the thalamus. The pituitary is kind of more of a gland. It's not really a portion of the brain. Even though it is highly innervated, it's other tissue. It's a manufacturing site for hormones in one way. Key part of this process is keeping anterior and posterior straight. In biology, anterior means towards the head and posterior means towards the butt. In medicine, anterior means towards the front and posterior means towards the back. So these two halves of the pituitary are named for the front versus back orientation. If this were really named properly, this would be called the ventral pituitary, which is the front side. This would be called the dorsal pituitary, which is the back. But there you go. Sometimes terminology conflicts. Okay, the posterior pituitary is nice and simple. We are doing neurohormones. So these things are coming out of neurosecretory cells. They are non-tropic. They are endocrine. So oxytocin, we already mentioned, is going to hit the breast tissue. Antidiuretic hormone is going to affect your kidneys primarily. And we've already talked about that one too when we talked about peeing. So in this case, the real function of the posterior pituitary is not to manufacture hormones so much as it is a network of capillaries. So it's a capillary bed into which the neurosecretory cells that started up in the hypothalamus can dump their load of hormone. So it's the posterior pituitary really isn't doing much. It's just kind of like a warehousing space. Now, the anterior pituitary is going to be a lot more interesting. First off, the hormones of the anterior pituitary are all in a two-step process. So we're talking about a neuroendocrine pathway, a full neuroendocrine, not just neurohormone, but nervous system hitting an endocrine gland, which then sends out signals. So you're going to have releasing hormones. They're going to come from the hypothalamus. They're pretty much all named whatever releasing hormone, like prolactin releasing hormone. That comes from the hypothalamus, hits the anterior pituitary, causes the anterior pituitary to then release the actual prolactin. All right. So everything that the hypothalamus is going to send to the anterior pituitary is going to count as a tropic hormone. All right, all the releasing hormones are. What it releases in response to that could be tropic or it could be non-tropic. Prolactin, for example, which contrasted to oxytocin, oxytocin causes you to relax and release the milk. Prolactin causes you to make the milk to begin with. So prolactin is going to be our milk production. All right, tropic effects. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Okay, those are going to be involved in making sperm and egg cells. Yeah, same hormones, completely different outcome in males versus females. Remember, it can be receptor, it can be signaling, the signaling cascade afterwards. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to hit the thyroid gland. Okay, will follicle stimulating hormone hit the testes, which are themselves, or ovaries, which are both endocrine glands. Thyroid stimulating hormone hits the thyroid. Now, this one's my favorite hormone, by the way. The adrenocorticotropic hormone. Oh, looky there. It's all built in the name. It's going to hit the adrenal gland. And you already know that the cortex is the outer layer. The medulla is the inner layer. So it's going to hit the adrenal cortex. And since the adrenal gland is an endocrine gland, that's going to also make it a tropic hormone. Okay. So there you go. Those are the big ones. I'm not going to go into too much about melanocyte stimulating hormone because it's kind of boring to me. And growth hormone is so complicated that I also don't want to go into it. There's just too much to go into there. Okay. So let's talk about thyroid hormone. You've got a lot going on here. This is a cascade because you've got the hypothalamus dropping a thyroid releasing hormone. Okay, it's THS or TSH releasing hormone, which is then going to cause the anterior pituitary to release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. When that hits the thyroid, then the thyroid is going to itself release more hormone. Okay. So what's the thyroid going to release? It's going to release a whole bunch of the T3 and T4 hormones. Those hormones are going to send back to the thyroid and hypothalamus, or to the pituitary and hypothalamus, a stop message. Weird thing, the thyroid gland is in the neck, and if you don't get enough iodine, which is a key component of T3 and T4 hormones, okay, you don't get enough iodine, your neck will swell up. Okay, and what's going on there is that the thyroid gland is swelling and it's overproducing because it's being constantly stimulated by the hypothalamus hitting the pituitary with the thyroid releasing hormone. The pituitary is now releasing the thyroid stimulating hormone, and that's all hitting the thyroid, but the thyroid itself can't produce T3 and T4. So it just gets signaled harder and harder and harder, and that gland just grows bigger and bigger and bigger, overstimulated, because it can't send any negative feedback back up the chain to tell the pituitary to shut the heck up. Okay. We are not going to talk a lot about development hormones here. We'll leave that to chapter 46, and even then I won't talk a huge amount about them because you can go into it, you can quickly get into the concept of just memorize on these hormones, and that's not where I want you to be. I want you to know some specific hormones that have specific effects, but I want you to know them as an example of how this system can work, not as the end-all be-all of everything. Here's a neat one. Parathyroid hormone. Okay, para meaning near the thyroid, so it's kind of these little dots that are attached to the thyroid. Okay, your parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone, and calcitonin is released by your thyroid. Okay, so what are we going to do with these? Well, they're going to have antagonistic effect. Parathyroid hormone is going to do something that causes you to increase your uptake of calcium, both in the kidneys here so that you pull it back out of the urine, and also the kidneys will then do some chemistry to activate vitamin D. Now don't ask, why do the kidneys have to activate the vitamin D? I don't know, but they do. And that vitamin D will cause your intestines to suck in more calcium. Okay, this sounds like a good thing, right? And that's going to somehow help maintain calcium and get plenty of calcium into the body, so women should take parathyroid hormone to avoid osteoporosis. Okay. The osteoporosis can actually be accelerated by parathyroid hormone because parathyroid hormone also causes calcium to be released from the bones. Why does it do this? Your blood needs a certain amount of calcium in it. And your muscles also need calcium in order to flex, like at all. So you've got to keep a reasonable supply of calcium in the blood, or else some important muscles like, oh, I don't know, the diaphragm or the heart might stop beating. Okay, so this is what parathyroid hormone does. It causes, not only does it cause you to take it in through your intestines and keep it in your kidneys, it also causes you to purge it from your bones. So it's not a good way to maintain high calcium levels. The way you maintain high calcium levels is you hit yourself with calcitonin. That causes the reverse. It causes your bones to suck up the calcium. Problem though, it causes your blood calcium to drop. So if you artificially take too much of that, it can kill you. And so this is the circular argument that causes osteoporosis in women, because when you have too little calcium in your bloodstream, ergo, if you eat a whole bunch of calcium, you've got to convince somehow your intestines to take up that calcium, right? Well, it won't do that unless your bloodstream is low in calcium. Okay, well that sounds good, except now it's already depleting your bones of the calcium. And if you get plenty of calcium, yay, it's going to start putting it back in your bones, except now you're busy peeing out the calcium and not taking it up from your meal anymore. So dang it, how do you win? And the way to win is to have active vitamin D in your foods already placed in them. So maybe you've noticed calcium supplements already have vitamin D in them, and so does bread, and so does milk, to cause people's bodies to take up the calcium so that calcitonin will say, whoops, too much calcium in the bloodstream, let's pack it away in the bones, and make those bones a lot better about that. Adrenal gland, we've got cortical, right, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and we've got medullary hormones. The cortex gets hit by tropic hormones from the anterior pituitary, and since this is a chemical signal, this is a slower response. Okay, these things cause long-term stress. Okay, so long-term stress, I'm not talking about necessarily being upset about work. I'm talking about like being dehydrated for a long period of time, or low amounts of food, or being fearing for your life. Now, working too hard and becoming over anxious about work, where some people start to think about it to the point that they think about it like death. Okay, they fear their boss's ire as if he was going to physically abuse them, even though that's not true. It can incorrectly wire in the brain, and they can start doing these long-term stress responses, like retaining salt and water, becoming bloated, increasing the blood pressure, and suppressing their own immune system. All right. This is generally considered not to be a good thing to do unless you are actually in a stressed out environment. Like if you are busy running through the jungle for your life because you're being hunted, you need to not have to stop to get water or to go pee. So that's why we want to retain the salt and retain the water. It's because we don't know when we'll get our next drink. Okay, you gotta keep that blood pressure and blood volume up because we might need to pump a whole lot of oxygen to survive. These are not good things to have going for you in multiple days because they hurt your heart, and they make your body feel bad. However, short-term stress response, the boo stress response, somebody yells at you, comes straight down the spinal cord and nervous cells innervating the medulla, hit the medulla and say, "Hey, secrete." So the medulla says fine and starts releasing adrenaline. Okay. What does that do? Well, it causes sugar breakdown in the liver, which we already mentioned. It also causes an increased blood pressure, but it's going to be short time. It's going to be increased breathing rate, but also increased metabolic rate. All right. In fact, all of these short-term stresses are kind of good for you. It's good to break down your glycogen. It's good to get your breathing rate up. It's good to increase your metabolism. And so short-term stresses like running 10 miles, that's short-term, by the way, good for the body, good responses. Long-term stresses are bad for you. Short-term fasting, so like 1 day of fasting and then you eat again, good for the body. Long-term fasting, so not eating for multiple days in a row, bad for the body. Okay, if you eat every other day and skip a day in between, that's actually reasonably healthy for you, and it's much healthier than the way most people eat because it's constantly cycling these short-term stresses where the metabolism goes up. It's kicking that metabolism up, kicks up the breathing rate, it gets the body going, it gets you excited, whereas constantly eating food all the time kind of depresses your metabolism. But if you were to starve yourself for several days in a row, the body would switch over to long-term stress. That's a problem. You don't want cortical adrenal hormones coming out. It's the corticoids. Oh, corticoids, as in from the cortex. Okay. Let's see, I don't really need to say anything about that. I've already said all that. Blah, blah. Okay. Gonadal hormones, sex hormones. You have the estrogens, the androgens, and the progestins. Androgen is the same as testosterone. Estrogen is estrogen. Progestins help you maintain pregnancy. Okay. I I'm not exactly sure what the progesterone does for a male, but I know it also helps us. All right. Now, funny side note. Let me see, do I have a picture of it? No. Okay. Funny side note. Testosterone causes your increase in muscle and bone mass. Okay, that's the masculinizing hormone, and is the original anabolic steroid. Anabolic, to build up. Okay, it is a steroid. That's what testosterone is. So the original juicing that athletes used to do was to take bull testosterone because it is more potent in its chemical mixture when affecting humans. It hits harder. Okay, well, funny thing, there's supposed to be a signaling, a negative feedback between the testes and the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is supposed to send down signals that cause the testes to create sperm cells, and it also causes the testes to grow some. The testes create the testosterone, which feeds back and tells the pituitary, okay, slow down. I don't need as much follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. I'm the right size. I'm producing enough sperm cells, thank you. Well, if you are artificially taking a whole bunch of testosterone, you are slamming your pituitary and saying, shut up, shut up, shut up. Stop releasing the luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormones. So the testes stop receiving their growth signals. They stop receiving the signals that say make sperm cells. So they shrink and become impotent. So that's why one of the side effects of taking too many steroids was shrinkage and impotence, because it was a negative feedback. You were jumping to the end, bypassing the testes entirely, and shutting down the signal that the testes were supposed to be getting to grow at all. Okay, and that's why it's okay to make fun of using illegal drugs. See, that's one category where it's still okay. So if you want to make fun of someone juicing with steroids, or you want to make fun of someone using cocaine because it does funny things that they should know better, that's still an accepted thing in our society. Though I wouldn't make fun of the steroid user to his face, because rage also comes with the extra testosterone levels, roid rage. All right. Estrogens, you know what? We're going to get into estrogens here in a minute when we talk about reproduction. So I'm going to let the estrogens wait until then, and we'll go into estrogen and progesterone then.